Hello and most welcome to 1795 of the Heidegger series. I will today look a bit deeper into an argument put forward by Naomi A. Lan, Gestaltschwitzes, and we'll look into a bit how do these work, what is the functioning of them. Naomi Lan divides Wittgenstein's counter-arguments against the Gestalt idea into two parts. Arguments against the new object claim and arguments against the pure vision claim. We've already briefly touched upon the first argument against the new object claim, which is simply just a statement of the paradox. Or as Elan also calls it, the objection from phenomenology. She explains that if we say we're seeing two different objects, one before and one after the switch, we distort an element of phenomenology of aspect switches that Wittgenstein regards as essential to it. This means that there is an essential phenomenological component to aspect switches, which we could call sameness after change. Wittgenstein emphasizes it many times throughout his critique of Köhler and also in connection with perception. In the second part of Philosophical Investigations, he states that the expression of change of aspect is an expression of a new perception and at the same time an expression of an unchanged perception. We can now see that for Wittgenstein there's an essential difference between object change and aspect change. Namely that in the second case there's a kind of sameness that persists throughout the change, and this cannot be found when objects really change. This phenomenological part that stays the same is what makes the cases of Köhler's organizational changes fundamentally different from the change in color and shape. If you disregard this difference and emphasize that there is indeed a new object after aspect change, you are faced with another issue, another problem, which brings us to Wittgenstein's second argument, dealing with the location of visual impression. Someone who puts the organization of a visual impression on a level with colors and shapes will be taking it for granted that the visual impression is an inner object. Of course, this makes this object chimerical, a strangely vacillating entity, for the similarity to a picture is now impaired. The problem, as Wittgenstein perceives it, arises from the previously mentioned sameness of the change. When the organizational aspect changes, something does indeed change. But we can clearly see that something else stays the same. We cannot grasp what this something is exactly. But the fact is that if you want to disregard that which stays the same, like Köhler does, and focus only on the new object which is completely different after the change, you need to move the object before you from the external world to some kind of internal world. If you claim that, just as with shape and color, everything has changed because with that external object you can clearly see that after the aspect of change there is that previously mentioned something that stay the same. Therefore, you need a new playground, an internal object world in this case, where there really is a complete change in object when aspect change. There is that previously mentioned something that stay the same. Therefore, you need a new playground, an internal object world in this case, where there really is a complete change in object when aspects switch. As Wittgenstein points out, this makes object chimerical. And there's no firm grasp of it anymore. Furthermore, taking this course looks as if, instead of trying to solve the problem, you are putting every effort into eluding it. Köhler, in Wittgenstein's view, disregard the external object world because it does not fit his theory of there really being a new object after the change. The problem is that such argumentation does not explain the phenomenon of the unchangingness, which persists as an essential component of the phenomenology of aspect change. The new object claim, which was thoroughly discussed above, is obviously linked to the pure vision claim. Which we have briefly mentioned, but Wittgenstein's objections to the latter take us in a completely different direction. Let us turn to Wittgenstein's favored example of the Rubin vase. Looking at this picture, I say I see a vase you'd be recommended to look up the Rubin vase. And then after recognizing two faces, I exclaim, but now I see two faces. Similarly, when looking at the painting of a horse, I will say I see a horse, and then after being shown a picture of a deer, I will say I see a deer. The problem lies in the word see. It is indeed the same word used in all four cases. But it is essentially different in the first two. What Wittgenstein claims is that the fact we use the word see in all of the above cases does not mean that all of the cases of change are the same. The one, what do you see there? I see this, then a description, a drawing, a copy. The other, I see a likeness in these two faces. Although the same word see is used, Wittgenstein claims that it can mean very different things when used with different examples. With this problem, Wittgenstein takes us beyond simply arguing against Köhler. He tries to find reasons behind Köhler's mistake. Sources of Köhler's mistake. We have already mentioned Wittgenstein's starting point in explaining many different uses of the word see. His main argument against Köhler that follows from this is that Köhler made a mistake because he focused too much on the similarities between what he called organizational changes and changes in shape and color. Köhler's mistake can be explained in two ways. First, as Eilan discovers in her article, Wittgenstein believes that Köhler makes a kind of semantic mistake, mixing up two different meanings of the word see. There's nothing wrong in saying we see the changes in organization, just like we say we see the change of a picture before us. In fact, there is no better way of explaining the aspectual changes than with the word see. The difference, however, is the meaning. In other words, as Elan explains it, Wittgenstein's diagnosis of Köhler's new object claim is this: what makes Köhler say that we are confronted with a new concrete visual object after the switch is the complete naturalness of saying that we see the new organization. And hence that it must be born by a new concrete object. The second way of explaining Köhler's mistake is the way Dinishak does in her PhD thesis. She argues that Wittgenstein believes the main reason for Köhler's mistake is a false comparison or analogy made by the Gestaltist between the two concepts of change. She believes Wittgenstein argues that the claims that figure in Köhler's theory express an inclination to favor a comparison between seeing aspects and seeing color and shape. He believes that, just as in the second case, there's a new visual object that emerges after the change in the first case. In her PhD thesis, Dinishak also quotes paragraph 879 from Wittgenstein's remarks on the philosophy of psychology, where he directly mentions analogy and explains what we have just mentioned. I see two different visual objects, you say, which merely have something in common with one another. In saying that you are only laying stress on some analogies at the expense of others. But now this emphasis needs to be grammatically justified. The main problem Wittgenstein sees is this: using an analogy between two concepts often makes us neglect the main differences between these two concepts. In this case, the differences are so important that they negate Köhler's analogy and overrule the similarities between seeing and seeing aspect. Seeing colors. From the concept of organization as explained by Köhler and other Gestalt psychologists, Wittgenstein has taken us further into the problem of seeing itself. But unlike the psychological or biological treatment of this subject, we have begun uncovering it in a philosophical way, leaving the opposition between Wittgenstein and Köhler behind. We can ask ourselves this: what more can Wittgenstein's philosophy tell us about seeing? Or better, where does this philosophically treated concept of visual perception in Wittgenstein's philosophy come from? Colors are one of the subjects that occupied Wittgenstein throughout his life and philosophical career. As such, they are directly connected with sight. But for Wittgenstein, colors represent much more. In his hands, they become a tool for uncovering all kinds of different philosophical problems that go beyond sight. For example, in Tractatus, colors help him define elementary particles and preposition. prepositions. And in philosophical investigations, colored squares are used to drive home the point of different contexts of language games. However, there exists another text which focuses almost exclusively on colors and also touches on the problem of seeing. Remarks on colors. There are many similarities between Wittgenstein's oppositions to Köhler and some of the ideas presented in Remarks on Color. But one of the most important ones is Wittgenstein's trying to emphasize the importance of a word's surroundings. We have mentioned how one of the reasons he finds behind Köhler's mistake is that Köhler did not make the right distinction between the use of the word see in one context and the other. In Remarks on Color, Wittgenstein exemplifies the same point in paragraph 57 of the first part. I feel X. I observe X. X does not stand for the same concept in the first and the second sentences. Even if it may stand for the same verbal expression, that is pain. This already alludes to one of Wittgenstein's main points, which is that words have no set or concrete meanings. Mighty important. He emphasizes this by asking the questions about seeing over and over again, like in paragraph 333. And what is seeing? How should we answer it? By teaching the questionnaire the use of the word see. If we cannot even decide exactly on what it means to see, how can we then use this exact same word as the basis for our argument, like Wittgenstein believes Köhler does? What Wittgenstein is trying to tell us is that things are never easily explained when dealing with language. And we are dealing with language only with language throughout our lives. So seeing in connection with colors, anything like seeing in connection with aspects. We could say with Wittgenstein, yes and no. On the one hand, it is completely different because there's an essential difference between the changing color and in our visual perception and the change in organization. On the other hand, we cannot describe one or the other more precisely than with the word see. Or better, we cannot say that one is seeing and the other one is not. When you see a color change, you do see it, and when you see organization change, you see that too. But you do not see it in the same way. And now we can ask with Wittgenstein, but how do you see it? And can the word see be explained by comparing these two? Here we come back to the problem of differentiating meanings of the same word in different contexts. But I also believe this shows us something else. We have to observe every problem from multiple points of view if we ever hope to uncover some truth about it. And what we know of Wittgenstein's opposition to Köhler, we could say that Köhler's mistake was he did not look beyond psychology and science when trying to uncover the phenomenon of organizational changes or Gestaltschwitzes. However, we could also say that Wittgenstein was too philosophical. That maybe not every concept is best explained with philosophical inquiry only. Conclusion. For Wittgenstein, there was much more to the problem of visual objects and visual perception than a simple disagreement with Köhler. What he wanted to achieve and what he showed is that these problems can never be discussed from a singular point of view. What visual objects are and how they are affected by change, for example, which is what this article is concerned with, is examined and explained quite differently when observed from a scientific psychological point of view, as opposed to a philosophical one. While both the philosopher and the gestaltist focus on the concept of organization or gestalt in connection with our visual perception, we can in general summarize the main differences between them as follows. Köhler focuses almost exclusively on the differences before and after the organizational change. And this leads him to conclude that organizational changes are, just as changes in color and shape, a purely visual phenomenon intertwined with visual objects. Gestalts are visual and cannot be considered anything but. They are independent of our interpretation. We see one object in one case and another after the change occurs, but never both at the same time. Wittgenstein, on the other hand, focuses on the similarities before and after what he calls aspect switch. He believes that Köhler is wrong in making an analogy between color, shape, and object ground. For him, what is essential is that even after the switch, nothing has changed, in a sense. He believes that we cannot disregard the fact that there is something different when talking about color shapes, as opposed to object ground. For Wittgenstein, that sameness which persists when organization changes is the key to uncovering a very special phenomenon which he calls noticing an aspect. I believe that the point of showing these opposing theories was not to decide once and for all who, Wittgenstein or Köhler, was right in this regard, but rather to show that just as with colors, we first need to establish the context and understand the language game we are playing to then properly understand the meaning of anything. Perhaps a better way to put it would be, in Wittgenstein's terms, to grasp the words correctly. There are numerous writings on the topic of science versus philosophy. But Wittgenstein's opposition to Gestalt psychology can teach us that there are no straight paths to truth. Visual perception can be examined from a psychological perspective as well as a philosophical one. So, a very interesting viewpoint, but it also brings into considerations what we know from quantum mechanics. There are no objects out there. Neither are the objects in here. They are not figments of my imagination. Neither are they independently existing things out there. Neither of these two options. Attacking one will actually reinforce the other, because it's hiddenly assumed. Wittgenstein is showing it actually doesn't make any sense of neither of the oppositions. Not inner visual objects, like a clear image of outer reality, which I can keep in my head, nor an independent object with color, mass, shape, weight, length, breadth, broadness, height, and so forth. No, it is in the complementarity of both, and it's already in the pre-existent, global, enormously complicated conditions that constitutes our life world. They cannot be selected out, cut out from the flesh of reality and put to the foreground and say, this is a slash of reality. No, that's nonsensical. It will have no or very little meaning to do a thing like that. That will be a sort of Wittgensteinian forehanden, to take an Heideggerian phrase. Very interesting, the thinking, and it's interesting also to know that Köhler is the interlocutor of philosophical investigations. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon or night, wherever you are. Bye bye for now.